My name is Doofy, and in 2025, I recorded every time I read manga. This is my 2025 Manga Wrapped. Initially, I set out to read a manga a day, an idea I stole from Axel Ablaze. I managed to keep this pace up for a couple of months before the crushing reality of adulthood made me realize such an endeavor was not possible. However, what did I read? Well, I still managed to read 142 manga. That's one manga every 2.6 days. And that included 2,040 chapters and 252 volumes, or 5.6 chapters per day and 0.7 volumes per day. Let's take a look at the demographic breakdown of what I read this year. I read 7 shonen, 9 shoujo, 11 josei, 17 adult, 39 without a dedicated demographic. So here we're thinking of largely manga from magazines like Garo, Axe, Manga Wrapped, things with a more diverse demographic range that don't necessarily conform to any one label. And of course, to no one's surprise, 61 seinen. So we look at that by a percentage breakdown. The overwhelming majority, of course, is seinen, with 42% of what I read being seinen. The smallest, interestingly, being shonen, something that I wouldn't have guessed on the onset of this year, but again isn't entirely surprising. Now, speaking of magazines, I read 75 different magazines this year. Some of the most popular magazines include Horror M, Comic Burrs, and Axe, all of which I read 4 manga from. Manga Erotics F, which I read 5 manga from. Comic Beam, which I read 6 manga from. And coming in at number 1, Garo Magazine, of which I read 7 manga. Now similarly, I read manga from 95 different mangaka. This includes 4 from Jiro Matsumoto, 6 from Simon Dauman, 6 from Shintaro Kago, 6 from Naoki Yamamoto, and 7 from Nishioka Kyodai. When we look at the age of the manga that I read, the oldest manga that I read was Ningen Toke from 1962, coming in at 63 years old. Conversely, the youngest manga I read was Hiromi by Shuzo Oshimi, which came out in 2024, 1 year ago. If we look at my manga by year, we'll see I did read from a large range of years, stemming back from, like I said, 1962 all the way up until the late 2020s. Now this chart isn't updated, as the most manga I read was from 2006, which should be 8 manga. However, coming in at second is actually a 4-way tie between 2000, 2008, 2010, and 2012, all of which I read 7 manga. Let's take a look at Doofy's average manga. So I took the average of the year a manga debuted from my 2005 readings, the average amount of volumes, chapters, my anime list score, and demographic, and I found a couple candidates for what would be the most average Doofy manga based on what I read in 2025. A big candidate, and the one that I perhaps feel the strongest about, is Doll, which came out actually in 2008, so I'm sort of cheating here. It debuted in Afternoon Magazine with 2 volumes and 14 chapters. It has a 6.2 rating on my anime list, and frankly, this does feel like a average Doofy manga. If anybody's read this or any of Tatsuya Okoto's works, you'll know they're very Oshimi adjacent content-wise. They have a lot of that kind of psychoanalytic perspective on relationships and introspection, which I personally find very interesting. A couple other candidates that I found that are just, again, statistically similar to what my average manga would be is Witchblade. It debuted in Champion Red. It's 2 volumes and 12 chapters with a 6.77 my anime list score. Witchblade, of course, being a comic book series, I believe, which was then given anime adaptation. And this manga was kind of a collaborative project to, in part, promote the anime and also allure in Western readers. So it's in full cover and it actually reads from left to right. Very visually stunning manga, but an otherwise average plot. I'm not entirely sure how Doofy core this is, but there are definitely aspects of it that I can see. And then the last candidate here is Lives by Masayuki Taguchi, which is the mangaka behind Battle Royale. And I would say this largely checks out. This also debuted in Champion Red, and as it turns out, a lot of manga from Champion Red seem to be up my alley in theory. This one's 2 volumes and 11 chapters with a 6.4 My Anime List score. Now let's take a look at my top 5 according to My Anime List. What are the 5 statistically best manga I read this year? Well, at number 5, we have Showa, which has a score of 7.95. At number 4, we have Shiver, which has an 8.0 rating. At number 3, we have Planets, which has an 8.23. At number 2, we have Summit of the Gods, which has an 8.24. And at number 1, the supposedly best manga I've read this year was Parasite, which has an 8.37. So I forgot to edit this slide, but this should be my top 5 according to me, my personal score, my personal top 5. And spoiler alert, it is shockingly similar to the My Anime List top 5, which I think is interesting as I normally mentally clock myself as somewhat of a contrarian wanting to be different, and that's something I discuss at length in my Kids Shouldn't Watch Anime video. But there's a lot of overlap this year between what I thought was my favorite and what My Anime List thought was the best. So number 5 is Showa, which I gave an 8.5. And number 4 is Parasite, which I also gave an 8.5. Number 3 is Summit of the Gods, which I gave an 8.5. Now number 2, and this is where I start to deviate slightly, is Wanito Kageisu by Minoru Furuya. This was really the year that I really got into Minoru Furuya, and I'm shocked that he actually wasn't in my top 5 most read mangaka, but I reckon that perhaps I read a couple of his works late last year, and I gave this one an 8.5. And then finally, my favorite manga that I read this year was Planets, which I actually ended up giving a 9. Now, on the whole, my scores were on average only 0.07 lower than My Anime List. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of my largest deviations, which were this fucked up dog manga, which was the object of much debate in my Discord. It only has a MAL score of 5.11. However, I actually gave it like a 7.0. I almost want to do a video on it, but it is like kind of fucked up and not something I want to dedicate a lot of like my public energy and image to. So here is just a little slide to commemorate this interesting manga. And Hiki, which had a My Anime List score of 6.08, and I only gave a 4. I mean, this was quite bland. I do believe this is actually my largest difference. So, but that concludes my 2025 Manga Wrapped. What did you think was the most interesting part of this? How can I improve this for next year? And tell me about your year in manga. My name is Doofy. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and until next year, smell you later.